Shalom Aleichem, friends. Welcome to a shir, a class on Likutei Sichos. This is the Rabbi's magnum opus, the 40-volume set of the Rebbe's edited talks on all areas of Torah, the extraordinary monumental work. Today is a very, very exciting Sicha. They all are. This is in a different way. Today, what we're going to do is what you might call a pilpul. And it's going to be on the portion of Bo, which is, of course, the Torah portion, the current Torah portion. And what is a pilpul? What is a pilpul? So a pilpul is a Talmudic analysis of a halachic discussion. I opened up AI and I said, describe for me what a pilpul is. I'm not making AI an authority, but nevertheless, they sum it up sometimes. Pilpul, AI tells me this, refers to a method of Talmudic study that involves sharp analysis and debate to deduce insights and interpretations. It's like intense, rigorous mental gymnastics, often focusing on nuances and complexities of the text. And I think that's a pretty good interpretation of what pilpul is. So good for you, good on you, ChatGPT. This is a lot of the time when you are in a yeshiva of higher study, pre-rabbinics, if you will, this is what you do. Just to study the legalese, the laws, doesn't take a lot of time. It's pretty much laws, straightforward. A lot of the time spent in a yeshiva, hours and hours each day, 6 hours a day of studying the Talmud. It's not just studying the law, it's studying the background of the law, and analyzing the law, not just to know what to do, not just to know what the final conclusion is, because for that you could look in the Code of Jewish Law. It's short and sweet, but rather to know the background, where the conclusion come from, and what are the opinions. And this includes laws that are not practiced today at all. Much of the discussions about sacrifices, about the service in the temple, like today's discussion is going to be about the Paschal Lamb. It's not currently relevant. However, the mitzvah of study of Torah is to get into God's head and to know how Torah thinks, which is basically how God thinks, as put forth through the sages and the Talmud and the later commentaries, the early commentaries, the later commentaries, all the way down to the Rabbi. And all of this is a mitzvah. In fact, it's considered, according to Maimonides, the greatest mitzvah of Torah study, even greater than just learning the laws, because the mitzvah of Torah study, separate and apart from knowing what to do, is to connect to God in an intimate way. And the greatest intimate connection a human can have with God, a Jew can have with God, is that of the mind, where the two thoughts fuse. It's not just I do what God says, and not just I think about what God wants, but I start to think how God thinks. Think about the intimate connection between a teacher and a student. It's almost genetic, because you start thinking along the lines of somebody else. And that's what we do, especially when we study pilpul style study, when we are doing the mental gymnastics, as ChatGPT had it, to connect. So this is very, very special. I'm just moving that screen out of the way so it doesn't distract anybody. So let's open it up, the section. And this is a discussion on Maimonides' laws of Passover offering. And the discussion is about Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. We know that there's the main Passover, which is brought on the 14th day of Nisan in Temple Days. Hopefully very soon again when Mashiach comes, everybody would bring a Paschal Lamb, and it's a very, very important mitzvah. If someone misses it, it's terrible. It's punishable by cutting off of the soul. You know what I mean? It's a very, very big deal that you must bring the Paschal Lamb. And so much so that there were some people who couldn't bring it because they were impure, or sometimes a person can't bring it because they're in a distant location. They complained, and God gave them a makeup day called Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach. This is almost unique. I don't know anything really other in Judaism where you can do this. You missed it, and you can make it up. And God made another Pesach. I mean, we don't have a Sukkot Sheni or a Purim Sheni. We have a Pesach Sheni. If I didn't bring the Paschal Lamb on the 14th of Nisan, and not because I didn't care to, but because I was impure, I had had to go to a funeral or whatever, and I was impure in that way, or otherwise in a distant location, I get a makeup date a month later called Pesach Sheni. It's a phenomenal law, and it has tremendous lessons. It's never too late, etc., etc. So the first thing Rambam teaches us is, on top of the screen, Pesach Sheni is a separate festival, not just the first Pesach's makeup date. This is a discussion, the Talmud, it's a debate between Rabbi and some of the other sages. The other sages argue that Pesach Sheni is just a makeup date, which is, on the face of it, seems to be. Open up the Torah in the book of Numbers. You miss this date, you get that date. But Rabbi says, of course, it was given to us as a makeup date. But in and of itself, it becomes now its own festival. It becomes a bona fide second chance. What's the relevance of their discussion? The relevance would be, let's assume somebody did not have the obligation to bring the offering on the first Pesach. For example, they were a child. They weren't yet bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. But they're going to have their bar mitzvah in between, and they're going to have it before the second Pesach. Do they have now the obligation to bring the second Pesach? If it's just a makeup date, a makeup for what? They didn't have the obligation in the first instance. But if this date was given by God as another bona fide chance to do the mitzvah, I wasn't yet bar and bat mitzvah by the first Pesach, but now I am for the second one. Boom, it triggers, it hits. Parenthetically, this would also apply to a convert. If somebody converts to Judaism in between these two dates. See, if you hold it's just a makeup date, the convert would not bring the second Pesach because they didn't have the obligation for the first, so there's no point in making it up. But if it is a date that God gave as a second date, as a bona fide second opportunity, I became Jewish in between the two dates. When the second date hits, I have the mitzvah, I have the obligation. So halacha rules, Rambam rules that we go according to that opinion, Rebbe's opinion, as the top of the screen. The second Pesach is a separate festival, not just first Pesach's makeup date. I mean, it's also the makeup date, but it becomes now its own date, and therefore, the next line, a minor becoming bar and bas mitzvah between the two dates is obligated to bring the second Pesach, which is extraordinary. I did not have the mitzvah on the first Pesach, but now on bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah, I have the mitzvah. Got it. But here's where the real zinger comes, the third law of Rambam. However, if he was included in the first, he's exempt from the second. Let's assume, remember, the kid was 12, it was 12 years old and 11 months. And Papa included him in the family Paschal lamb and fed him from it, which is allowed, right? The family Seder table, everybody eats of the Paschal lamb. If he was included in that first sacrifice and partook in it, he's done. He or she is done. There's no need to make it up in the second Pesach. They're exempt from the second because they already did the first. And the commentaries have a problem with this. And the question by the Rambam commentaries, including the Kesef Mishnah, which is the primary commentary of Rambam, is how can a minor's non-obligatory first Pesach fulfill his second Pesach obligation? It's almost like the second and third line of the Rambam are in conflict. The second line says that the second Pesach is an obligation, a bona fide obligation on a minor who becomes bar mitzvah before the second Pesach. Because now I'm bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, Pesach Sheni comes, I got to bring it. Notwithstanding the fact that by the first Pesach, I was a kid and I had zero obligations. Kids have zero obligations in Judaism, ultimately. But then Rambam says something that seems to contradict it completely. That if my parents included me in the first Pesach, which was not an obligation at all, just like, let's call it a nice thing to do, education, I don't know, family experience, that exempts me from bringing this Pesach? How? That was done as a minor. That was done as a voluntary thing. That was done, it was kid stuff. It wasn't real. That exempts the biblical obligation. Remember, the bringing the Paschal lamb is not just a biblical obligation. It's a mega biblical obligation. And you say, don't worry, you did it as a kid. Really? How does that count? So this is a big problem that's asked by the commentaries. So there's an explanation that's given by various commentaries. I want to point something out, very important, that in this Sicha, which again is a very involved pilpul, the Rebbe goes off on different tangents and discusses them in and of itself. It's almost like going through a long maze. But in the process of going through the maze, we explore different side roads, and in those side roads itself, there's mazes. So in order for me to do this and get through this in a clear fashion, trying to present it in a way that could be followed by everyone, even somebody who never studied in a yeshiva. So I'm not going to go off on all those tangents. I'm going to touch upon them and move forward. My goal is to get us from the beginning of the maze to the end of the maze without necessarily touching upon everything. So this is a disclaimer. I'm not covering the side roads, the detours that the Sicha takes. But I think, please God, we're going to do justice to the main path of the Sicha. So the explanation that's given, and this again, the Rebbe discusses in a few different ways, but the bottom line is that the later day commentaries, he quotes the famous Rab Chaim, and he quotes the Rugged Shover, and he quotes, etc., that although it's non-obligatory, I'm reading, if he's included, it counts. It's true that the first Passover was non-obligatory for this kid who now became Bar Bas Mitzvah. They have no obligation. They don't have to do it. But if they did it, it counts. It's bona fide, and they don't bring the second Pesach. What's the logic? Because there's a verse in the Torah by the mitzvah of the Pesach, of the Paschal Lamb, which says a sheep for each household, which teaches us it's a biblical inclusion of minors. There aren't any other mitzvahs really in Torah that are mitzvahs on the household. A mitzvah is on a person. But the Paschal Lamb is a mitzvah on the household. The language is sel lebeit avot, a sheep for the household. It's very strange. It's like, the mitzvah on the father and the mother, the adults in the room, but it's on the household. This is like a family mitzvah. And remember, again, children have no biblical obligations, no real Torah obligations, but nevertheless, there's a concept that includes them. So how do you square that? The answer is the obligation they don't have, but if they're involved and included, it counts. It's bona fide counts. It's not counts for make-believe. It counts biblically. And that's the summary of the way the commentaries explain and answer this big question of the Rambam commentaries. So far we're good. Rambam rules again on top of the screen that a minor becomes bar mitzvah in between the two dates. They have a bona fide obligation to bring the second Paschal Lamb, but then he seems to contradict that and say, but if the first one was including them in it, they're now exempt from the second. How do you square that? How does the non-obligatory inclusion exempt the real biblical obligation of the second Pesach Sheni? And the answer is they are really included in the first Pesach Rishon. They're not obligated in it, but they're included in it. And they're included in it biblically because the verse says a sheep for each household. And therefore, again, it's not an obligation. There cannot be any obligations on minors. But if they were included, they're biblically included. And therefore, if they did it, it's done. That's how the commentaries will explain it. And all seems to be well. Says the Rebbe, there's a problem. The Alter Rebbe, in his code, quotes Tosfos. Tosfos is another one of the early commentaries known as the Rishonim, same era as Rambam, if you will. And the Tosfos disagrees with Rambam. And the Tosfos holds that language, a sheep for each household, teaches a rabbinic inclusion of minors just for training purposes. This is a big difference. While Rambam seems to say, based on the commentaries on the Rambam, we're going to say, argues that this special law, almost unique law, that there's a mitzvah sheep for the family, it's a biblical verse. It's a biblical inclusion. However, Tosfos, and he's an authority like Rambam, is his Rishonim, the early commentaries. Tosfos says a sheep for each household, even though it's in the Torah. It's not a biblical thing. You can never say that there's a biblical bona fide mitzvah that includes minors. However, it's almost like it's a hint. It's a verse in the Torah hinting to what? To what the sages, what the rabbinic inclusion, the rabbis introduced the concept that it's a mitzvah to teach our children. It's a mitzvah to train them. It's a rabbinic mitzvah because, again, there can never be a biblical obligation. a real bona fide obligation involving minors because they're minors. However, the sages said, look, you better educate your kids because otherwise they won't know what to do. And therefore, it's a rabbinic conclusion. This is how Tosfos reads it. And really, according to Tosfos and the Sicha discusses it, there are opinions that would say that they're not even allowed to eat from it, from the first Pesach when they're a kid, because, a child can't really be included and they can't be counted. And there's no biblical connection. However, because of education, it's an allowance. Now, this is not just the opinion of the Tosas, but it comes down in halacha and Jewish law. The Alter Rebbe in his code goes by this and says that the reason why the kid can be included in the first Paschal Lamb is only for chinuch, education, training purposes. All right. So far, we're still okay. Tosfos can disagree with Rambam, and the Alter Rebbe can go with Tosfos. That's okay. The problem is the Rebbe's question. Does the Alter Rebbe disagree with the Rambam's above ruling? Which ruling? The ruling that if you're included in the first, you're exempt from the second. This is a ruling of Rambam that we don't find anyone disagreeing with that. Any halachists and the commentaries on Rambam, they don't bring any opinion that disagrees. So it seems like that's the final word. That if the child was included in the first Pesach, they're exempt from the second. The Alter Rebbe, if he goes with the reasoning of Tosfos, well, that's okay. But what would he hold regarding this ruling? He doesn't spell it out. And therefore, but it seems that he would disagree with Rambam, and that's going to create a problem for us because there isn't any halachic authorities that disagree with Rambam. And why would we think he would disagree with Rambam? Because remember, the Alter Rebbe is saying that if you include the minor in the first Pesach, that's very nice and sweet, but there's nothing biblical about it. There's nothing real about it. It's a rabbinic conclusion for the sake of education and training. Mazel tov, you gave the kid a nice Jewish experience, but don't think for a second that anything biblical happened. So the Alter Rebbe would therefore logically say that when it comes to second Pesach, and now the kid is bar bat mitzvah, they must do it, because now they have a biblical obligation. That would disagree with Rambam, and again, nobody disagrees with Rambam. You see, in Judaism and in Torah and in Paltiel, commentaries can disagree on the reasonings of things. But when it comes to the halacha, you see, the halachas, there are three major halachic authorities upon which the Code of Jewish law was really built. This is on an aside sort of. There are three major authorities that are called poskim, the halachic decisors. And they are Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush. And Rabbi Yosef El-Fasi and the Rush, Rabbeinu Osher. And when the Beis Yosef wrote the Code of Jewish Law, and the Alter Rebbe's code is an extension or a commentary on it, how did he decide the law? Based on two of the three. And very often Rambam and Rif and the Rush disagree, and two out of the three becomes the law, and etc. And that's the basis of how the Code of Jewish Law was developed. In a case where Rambam makes a ruling, and the other two don't disagree, it's strange that the Alter Rebbe, who's a latter-day code, almost a overlay to the Code of Jewish Law, would disagree with Rambam. And this is a serious problem. But here it seems to say the Alter Rebbe, in the logic of this law, sides with Tosfos. He doesn't believe, like Rambam, that the minor's inclusion in the first Pesach is biblical and real. But it's just an educational experience. So the logic would follow that if the kid comes now to Pesach Sheni when he or she is of age, they have to do it. But Rambam says they don't, and nobody disagrees with it. So this becomes a problem. In the next screen, I sum up what we just learned, just to make it clear and sum it up. There's really nothing new on this screen that you don't already know from the first screen. This is like a summary of what we learned. What did we learn? Minor's inclusion in Pesach offering. What is the significance of a minor's inclusion? The kid is 5 years old, 10 years old, or in our case, 12 years and 11 months. Or for the girl, 11 years and 11 months. And you invite them to the Seder and you include them and you give them a piece of the delicious Seder, a carbon Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, the delicious barbecue. Rambam holds it's a biblical inclusion based on the verse, a sheep for each household, which teaches us that this is a household mitzvah. The Alter Rebbe holds, he sides with the Tosfos, that it's actually rabbinic. Even though there's a verse in the Torah which says a sheep for his household, the sages are using that as a hint. But really, it's just for training. It's rabbinic in nature. It's nice to do it. It's good to train your kids, but it has no bona fide biblical, holding or standing. All right, so we understand the difference, the way they think about the inclusion of the minor in the Pesach offering. But now here's the next question. A minor who was included in the first Pesach, do they bring the second one? Rambam says they're exempt from the second one. And we know the logic. Because if they brought the first one, it's a biblical thing. They did it. I don't care that they were a child. They did it. So even though the second Pesach, they have an obligation biblically, they already did that biblical obligation. But according to the Alter Rebbe, what would he say? But the second Pesach, they have a biblical obligation, right? Remember that? Because the two Pesachs are two separate holidays. Even though they were a child and exempt from the first one, when the second one comes, they have a biblical obligation to bring it. So they got to bring it. So you can say, well, they already were included in the first, but that was for training. That was rabbinic at best. And therefore, what would the Alter Rebbe hold? The logic would be that he would disagree with Rambam and say, no, they must bring Pesach Sheni. But it's impossible to say that because nobody disagrees with Rambam on this particular law, none of the halachists. And the commentaries of Rambam don't even bring that there's such a possibility based on the thinking of the Tosfos, etc. And therefore, where does that leave us? So therefore, the question is on the bottom of the screen, or on the right side of the screen, how do we reconcile the Alter Rebbe with the Rambam if the minor's inclusion in the second Pesach is rabbinic, only for training? How could it exempt the second Pesach biblical obligation? And it seems that it cannot. So the Alter Rebbe will be in conflict with Rambam. It doesn't make any sense. So we have to square that. We have to find a way. I put that question again on top of the screen here because I like to reiterate what we learned. We have to find a way to have the cake and eat it. On the one hand, we know clearly the Alter Rebbe holds, like the Tosfos thinking, that the minor's inclusion in the first Pesach is a rabbinic in nature, just for training. It's not real. I'm a baseball guy. The home runs that you hit during the spring training don't count for your season. It just doesn't count for the tally. The Rambam would hold that the spring training counts. It's biblical. The Alter Rebbe goes with the Tosfos and says, no, it's spring training. It's Gunish mit Gunish. It's GMG, nothing. He was a kid. It's education. So how could it exempt the second Pesach? And let's assume he has to hold like Rambam that nevertheless, even though the kid was included in the first Paschal Lamb, just as a nice family educational experience, it's nothing biblical. But if he ate that meat, when it comes to second Pesach, even though he or she is now bar mitzvah and have a biblical mitzvah to do it, they don't do it. It's done. How do you square that? Brilliant question. And it's going to be a brilliant answer. So, the Rebbe introduces a teaching of the Rugged Shavar Gaon, the great genius, the Rugged Shavar genius, which is brought many times in the Rebbe's Sichos. We have found correspondence, deep Talmudic correspondence from the Rebbe to him when the Rebbe was a young man and he was an older sage, and Rebbe considered him great authority, great genius of Torah. Rebbe once said that in our generation, this is such a mind of Torah, which is reminiscent of back in the day, and that's something extraordinary. And the Rugged Shavar introduces a concept. Quote, it's on the screen. A mitzvah performed while not obligatory exempts subsequent mitzvah obligation if the mitzvah effect still exists. So a person can do a mitzvah when they don't have an obligation, either a child or otherwise, as we're going to see. But if they did the mitzvah, and now the obligation kicks in at a later time, do they have to do the mitzvah again? Well, it depends. If that mitzvah effect still exists, they don't have to redo it. It's done. So the three examples that are given from the Rugged Shavar. Example number one, a minor who has children, fulfill the mitzvah, be fruitful, and multiply. Let's assume a minor could have children. There are opinions that say they could. I guess it's a hypothetical. But should the minor have children, and now he becomes bar mitzvah, now he has the biblical mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. When he was a kid, he didn't have that mitzvah. Then now does have to start all over and have kids? And the answer would be, says the rugged shaver, he doesn't have to have more kids because those kids still exist. Even though the mitzvah was performed in a non-obligatory state, the mitzvah still exists in the obligatory state. Another example, a Gentile who's circumcised for the sake of bris. Example number 2. A Gentile who's circumcised for the sake of bris and converts has fulfilled circumcision. Let's assume he's a non-Jew and he's a very religious non-Jew and a biblical non-Jew, and he wants to try to do mitzvahs. A non-Jew is allowed to do all the mitzvahs of the Torah except for Shabbos and Torah study. He wants to do a bris. It's considered a mitzvah. And he did it. And now he becomes Jewish. He doesn't have to redo it. It's only, of course, if he did it for the sake of a bris. If a person just has circumcision, as a medical procedure like most people do today in the hospital, when they later become a Jew, they have still an obligation of a bris. Even though the circumcision is done, they have to take a little bit of blood, they make a bracha to turn that circumcision into a bris. But in this case, the non-Jew did the circumcision for the sake of bris. He did it with a moel, with the intention of a mitzvah bris. So even though a non-Jew doesn't have that mitzvah, nevertheless, when he later becomes Jewish and he has that mitzvah, he still has it because it's been done and it still exists. And he doesn't even have to take that little bit of blood and make the bracha. Example number 3, says the rugged shaver, Goan. Goan means genius. That's the translation. A person studied Torah in childhood fulfills the mitzvah of knowing Torah. In addition to the mitzvah of studying Torah, there's a mitzvah to have knowledge, to collect knowledge of Torah. Let's assume the kid's brilliant. And as a young child, pre-bar mitzvah, the child collected a lot of knowledge of Torah. Now when he becomes post-bar mitzvah, technically he has already accomplished that mitzvah of collecting Torah knowledge. But you're going to say, what do you mean? He was a kid, he had no obligations. You're right. Only now does he have an obligation to know Torah. But now that he has the obligation to know Torah, he knows Torah. He didn't forget it. He still has it. And this is a rugged shaver's principle upon which the Sicha, the Rabbi, is going to explain this conundrum here. This in and of itself is fascinating. Again, let's read the rugged shaver's statement. A mitzvah performed while obligatory exempts subsequent mitzvah obligation if mitzvah effect still exists. Says the Rabbi, similarly here at the bottom of the screen, the minor's first Pesach exempts him from the second Pesach. What was the issue here? The issue is that the first Pesach was done as a minor. And according to the Alter Rebbe's thinking, like the Tosafos, that was not obligatory at all. As opposed to Rambam's thinking that the first Pesach of a minor, if it was included, it does have biblical standing. But according to the Alter Rebbe's way of thinking, he did it as a child. He had no obligation. It's not a real mitzvah. It's not a biblical mitzvah. It's a nice thing. It's a custom. It's a rabbinic thing. And therefore, however, the fact is he did the mitzvah already. So now when Pesach Sheni arrives, he already has it. Compared to any of these 3 examples. I was a kid and I studied Torah. I didn't have that mitzvah, but I gained knowledge. Now that I came to post-bar mitzvah, I have that knowledge. I'm done. You know that with the other 2 examples. Similarly here, this can be a 4th example. On the first Pesach, I'm a kid and I have no obligation according to the Alter Rebbe's thinking. No biblical obligation. But I did it. So when Pesach Sheni comes, I'm done. When the obligation kicks in, I'm already done. This is, in short, the Rebbe's answer. But the Rebbe is going to analyze it and push back and really force us to make sense of it. Let's see what happens. On top of the screen, you have the whole conversation so far. We have the Rebbe's question, how do we reconcile the Alter Rebbe with Rambam? Because if a minor's first Pesach is rabbinic and for training only, how could it exempt second Pesach biblical obligation? Big question. And we have the rugged shaver Goan's introduction. that a mitzvah performed while not obligatory exempts subsequent mitzvah obligation if the mitzvah effect still exists. So the Rebbe is suggesting similarly a minor's first Pesach exempts him from the second Pesach. Seems all good. But this needs analysis and clarification. That's what the Rebbe does here. The Rebbe gives two buts. And the Rebbe gives two explanations. This is where the fun kicks in. The first thing is, how is there a mitzvah effect from the fact that the kid ate the roasted Paschal lamb on the first Pesach when it comes a month later for the second Pesach? I mean, it's not still in his digestive system. Like, in what ways it's still here? How could you compare it to the three examples that the Rogatchover gave? A person is a child and they give birth to children. The children exist. It's a physicality. Person is a Gentile and they make a bris. The bris exists. It's a physicality. It's a reality. Person is a child and they study Torah and they gain that knowledge. They have that knowledge. It's a fact on the ground. How could you compare that to what we're talking about here? A person did the first Pesach, so they already have it? Like, what do they have? There's nothing physical to have. When a month later comes, what effect is there? It's like intangible. It's like intangible. For something to continue to be effective a month later, like, what's the connection? That's the Rebbe's first question. And then the Rebbe is going to ask a second question. Let's introduce it, and then we'll tackle one at a time. The second question is, the minor never really had a first Pesach obligation to begin with. So therefore, nothing really happened. When you say that a mitzvah carries from one day over to the next, that's only if it was a real mitzvah. No mitzvah really happened. But let's go back to A. Let's introduce them step by step because it's a little complex. The first question was, how does the mitzvah effect still exist? Because I brought a sacrifice on the first Pesach and now the second Pesach comes, it still exists. In what way does it still exist? So let's give an example to help this through. The example would be, the Rebbe's explanation is going to be, this is in the box, Rabbi explanation A, that the first Pesach and second Pesach, it's true they're two mitzvahs. Remember, right at the beginning of the Sicha, we introduced the opinion of Rabbi. It's two mitzvahs. And that's why, if you were a child, the first one, you still have to bring the second, etc. If you look up Rambam's list of mitzvahs in his book of mitzvahs, they are two mitzvahs. They're not one mitzvah with an addendum, with a PS. It's two mitzvahs. However, the Rebbe says they're two mitzvahs, but they're connected. One impacts the other. So to help understand this, I'm giving an example. I'm looking for an example, and I think I found one. What's another example in Torah where something is not one mitzvah, it's more than one mitzvah, but one rolls over or affects the other? I'm thinking of the mitzvah of counting of the Omer. Well, let's not talk about a child, an adult. There's 49 mitzvahs in the Torah that count the Omer. They're not one mitzvah. Every night when you do it, it's another mitzvah. The proof is that you make another blessing. And yet, it's 49 separate mitzvahs, but with one headline. Proof is that if I miss one day, I'm done. I can't continue to count. So you might say, since every night is another mitzvah, why can't I count if I miss one day? And the answer is, every night is another mitzvah, but it's the same theme. And therefore, yeah, it's all separate mitzvah, but it's really not. It's cumulative. So similarly here, the bringing of the first Pesach affects all the way to the second Pesach. So far, we're talking even an adult. Forget about the child. The Rebbe says, take a look. Take a look. If I brought the first Paschal lamb, I don't have to bring the second. Again, we're talking about an adult. But we already decided that the second Pesach is a separate holiday. Yes and no. It's a separate holiday, not just a makeup, but it's still part of the theme of Pesach. A little bit like the counting of the Omer. Each day is a separate mitzvah, but they're one cumulative mitzvah. The first Pesach and second Pesach are two mitzvahs. Rambam listed as two mitzvahs. And therefore, if you didn't have the first one, you got to do the second, even if you were a child, etc. But if you're an adult and you did the first Pesach and the second Pesach comes, you don't bring it. You're not allowed to bring it. But it's a separate mitzvah. Why don't I bring it? And the answer is, it's a separate mitzvah under the same umbrella. They are connected. And therefore, even though they're a whole month apart, and in between, for 29 days, you were eating bread. That's not true because you have the 7 days of Pesach. For 3 weeks, you were eating bread. For 3 weeks, Pesach was history. Nevertheless, somehow there's a magical connection between the 14th of Nisan and the 14th of Iyar. They sort of bridge over, and the mitzvah of Pesach connects them. Just like all the days of the Omer successively connect one to the other, even though they're separate mitzvahs, they're not really. So the first Pesach and the second Pesach are linked. And therefore, me as an adult, I brought the first Pesach. The second Pesach comes. I don't have to do it. Even though it's a separate mitzvah, that separate mitzvah was already taken care of. I want to give one more example, which I think will help clarify this. It's a mitzvah for a Jew to bring an offering when he comes to the Holy Temple. It's called Olas Re'iyah. You have to bring an offering when you come, or Shalmei Simcha. You have to bring peace offerings to celebrate the holiday. If I didn't bring it on the first day because there was too much backlog and many people are bringing offerings I couldn't get on the list, I bring it the next day. If not, I can bring it the third day. I have 7 days to bring it by each of the 3 major holidays. But once I brought it, I don't have to bring it on the other days. Let's assume I'm now on the 5th day of Pesach. I already brought it on the 3rd day of Pesach. And you're going to say, you're not bringing the offering, but it's Pesach. I'm talking about the offering, the peace offering. And the answer is, yeah, but it's one big holiday. In the same sense, the Rebbe is arguing that even though the 2 Pesachs are 2 mitzvahs, but they're still part of one continuum. And therefore, this is the simple, plain logic of why an adult who brings the first Pesach doesn't bring the second, because this mitzvah effect still exists. So when the 14th of Iyar comes, which we know is a separate holiday, the mitzvah effect still exists. He's already Pesached. Says the Rebbe, now we just have to find a way to apply this to the minor, and this becomes point number 2. So point number 1, we've sort of settled. How does a mitzvah effect exist a month later by the minor? Well, let's first understand how it exists by the adult. It clearly does, because even though it's a month later, and it's a different mitzvah on the list, if you will, nevertheless, it's not totally separate. It's one big umbrella, and therefore, if I come to Pesach Sheni and I've already been Pesach, I'm done. So therefore, it's not such a hard thing to understand how the mitzvah effect still exists, even though there's no reality on the ground like the other examples that the Rogatchover gives. But there is a spiritual reality on the ground that you have been Pesach. But now, let's talk about the child. This question B is more difficult. This is all true, point A, that when I come to Pesach Sheni and I already did the first, so I'm already Pesach. It is a reality on the ground in a metaphysical way, because the Pesachs are linked. But that's only if I was an adult. But in the first Pesach, if I was a child, you see, nothing really happened. We're not talking about a physical thing like somebody gave birth to children or somebody had a circumcision done. You're talking about a mitzvah reality, an existence that exists in the realm of the mitzvah. If you're a kid by the first Pesach and they included you at the table, no mitzvah happened, according to the thinking of the Alter Rebbe. It's just an educational family experience. It's a nice Jewish experience. It's like eating the Paschal Lamb on Purim. It's an education. It's a model Seder. As far as this kid is concerned, one might argue. So therefore, how could you say when the Pesach Sheni comes, this impact still exists? What impact? There's nothing, no physical on the ground. And even this whole argument of that a metaphysical, a spiritual mitzvah reality has been created, and he's Pesached, not in the case of the minor, nothing happened. A mitzvah reality only exists if it's a mitzvah. So here's where the Rebbe becomes extraordinarily creative. The Rebbe now has to bring his final point home. He's rounding third base. And he's going to introduce that when the kid was included in the first Pesach with no obligation, nevertheless, in a sense, his Pesach obligation, which will set in a month later on Pesach Sheni, already exists in some sense. But he's not bar mitzvah. It's almost like a retroactive, bona fide connection to the mitzvah, that the obligation, which kicks in a month later, is sort of retroactive a month before. Let's see how the Rebbe gets there. So the Rebbe says like this, you have to take this in a few steps. The Rebbe has taught us in other Sichas, and the Rebbe reintroduces here, revisits it here, the concept that even though a minor has no biblical requirement to do any mitzvahs, but in a sense they do. How? A minor, the Rebbe argues in other Sichas, again, this is brought here. I'm not borrowing from another Sicha. The Rebbe here borrows from another Sicha. The Rebbe argues this is very novel. I don't know if anybody else says this besides the Rebbe. I mean, he bases it on different things, but this is a very novel. The Rebbe argues that normally we say a child has no obligations, and even the mitzvah to educate the child is an obligation on the father, and it's a rabbinic mitzvah. Says the Rebbe, but you know what? The child themselves has a mitzvah, and a real biblical bona fide mitzvah to get themselves educated, because otherwise they won't be able to do the mitzvah. So let's assume I'm becoming bar mitzvah. I have an obligation the minute I'm 13 years old to put on tefillin. And if I'm a girl, her mitzvahs, whatever mitzvah I need to know. Let's use tefillin as the example. The day I become 13, I have a mitzvah biblically as if I'm 50. No difference. And therefore, I am obligated before that day arrives to make sure I get tefillin and I learn how to use them. If my father teaches me, great. But if he doesn't, I got to teach myself. The mitzvah is on this person, pre-adulthood. Because adulthood kicks in, they have the full bona fide responsibility. And they got to have the tefillin, they got to learn how to use it. And the same thing with every other mitzvah. The Rebbe argues that the minute they become bar mitzvah, they have to be proficient. And that's an obligation. And therefore, all the knowledge and all the technicalities and preparing the actual physical tefillin, etc., that happen before they become bar mitzvah are a real obligation on the kid. In the footnote, it brings an example. Let's say the kid becomes bar mitzvah on the first day Sukkot, and he needs to have a lulav. Let's assume his father didn't buy one for him. He has to buy himself a lulav. When? Before Sukkot. But he's a kid. How could you say he has an obligation? Kids have no obligation. Well, yes, they do. The adulthood obligation, which is kicking in tomorrow, kicks in the day before or the period before. The kid must make sure that he gets a lulav. And that's not rabbinic, and that's not custom, and that's not education, it's not spring training. You better get it, because you're going to have a biblical obligation, and therefore nothing happens without preparation. You don't shake a lulav unless you go get one, and therefore it becomes retroactive. This is a brilliant innovation of the Rabbi, that it's a biblical obligation on a child pre-bar mitzvah to make sure he's set up with the mitzvah that's coming. By the way, says the Rebbe, this is not unlike the argument that an adult has a biblical obligation to prepare for any mitzvah that's coming. An adult. We have a mitzvah as an adult to sit in a sukkah on Sukkot. The day before Sukkot or the week before Sukkot, there's no mitzvah of Sukkot. It's as if it doesn't exist. It's as if we're a non-Jew, because there's no mitzvah of Sukkot, right? The mitzvah of Sukkot only begins on the 15th day of Tishrei. Really? So I can ignore the whole concept of Sukkot and then show up on Sukkot and say, wait a minute, I have an obligation, but I didn't get a sukkah. Maybe I don't know where. I got to start thinking about getting a sukkah. And you can't even build a sukkah on Yom Tov. Is that the case? So everybody has an excuse not to do a sukkah, because before Sukkot, the obligation didn't kick in yet. And now that it kicked in, it's too late. No. That's obviously not true. It's obvious that if Torah said that when Sukkot kicks in, you must have a lulav, you must have a sukkah, that means pre-Sukkot you have a mitzvah, and not a custom, a biblical mitzvah to go get a sukkah. And this is true with every other mitzvah. An adult who has a mitzvah obligation at a certain time, I got to eat matzah on Pesach. That mitzvah kicks in when Pesach kicks in. Clearly, I have a mitzvah pre-Pesach to make sure that when Pesach kicks in, I have it. And I'm not doing it out of the goodness of my heart. I'm doing it out of a biblical obligation, retroactive to the mitzvah obligation when it sets in on Pesach. Says the Rebbe, apply that same logic of an adult being obligated, what's called hechsher mitzvah, mitzvah prep, biblically with the full binding of a mitzvah. Apply it to the child too. That if the child's becoming bar mitzvah the first day of Sukkot, he must get himself a lulav before Sukkot, even though he's a minor. He has a biblical obligation to do it. You know that with his tefillin or her mitzvahs that she has. Says the Rebbe, once we've established that concept, we've already got a glimpse of the answer to our Sicha. We have established a concept that a minor in the age of minority has a bona fide biblical obligation. Because when the mitzvah kicks in at bar and bat mitzvah, they got to be ready. So now the Rebbe is going to apply that concept to a very interesting scenario, which again the Rebbe borrows from another Sicha. The scenario is, let's assume the boy's becoming bar mitzvah on Shabbos, and it's the 15th of Adar. It's a Purim scenario. These examples are now on the screen, on the right side of the screen. Purim can't come out on Shabbos, but Purim can come out on Shabbos in Jerusalem and in walled cities. So the kid's living in Jerusalem, and it's Purim, the 15th day of Adar could come out. And here's where we have a problem. When Purim comes out on Shabbos, again in Jerusalem, it could come out the 15th of Adar. The Megillah is read on Fridays. We don't read a Megillah on Shabbos, just like we don't blow a shofar on Shabbos. What do you do with the Megillah? You read it on Friday. That's the halach. They read it on the same day of Purim where the rest of the world has Purim. What does this kid do? He's becoming bar mitzvah on Shabbos on the 15th of Adar. That's the only day when his obligation kicks in. If he reads the Megillah on Friday, he's a kid. So his Megillah obligation didn't kick in. So what's he going to do? And we never find anywhere in Jewish law that if a kid has a bar mitzvah on that day, which could happen, I'm sure it does happen, that this year he just doesn't do Megillah reading. I mean, Megillah reading is a real obligation. And he's a real boy. He's bar mitzvah now. So what does he do with the Megillah obligation? You can't read it on Shabbos. And his reading on Friday won't count because he's a kid. So what, he just doesn't do it that year? There's no such thing. So the Rebbe argues in the other Sicha, which he copies and pastes here. And the Rebbe says, he reads it on Friday, and it exempts his obligation from Shabbos. But you're going to say, what do you mean? How can his reading on Friday exempt the obligation on Shabbos? When he's Friday, he's a kid. He might as well be 5 years old. On Shabbos, he's an adult. He might as well be 50 years old. I mean, that's a cutoff point from no obligation to obligation. It's a hard stop. Says the Rebbe, yeah, it does. His reading of the Megillah on Friday is bona fide in the sense that retroactive, what have you, it's making his obligation of Shabbos go away. And the obligation of Shabbos is biblical. And this is similar but different to the fact that if Shabbos, if his birthday is the first day of Sukkot, he has a bona fide biblical obligation on the day before Sukkot to make sure he has a lulav. Even though it's not yet majority age, it doesn't matter. You can't suddenly have a lulav when you need it. The same thing with all the other mitzvahs I said earlier. He must have tefillin before he becomes bar mitzvah. That's biblical, and it's on him if his father doesn't do it. So you see that a child does have obligations pre-mitzvah, pre-bar mitzvah, if it's gonna actualize his ability to do the mitzvah when he becomes bar mitzvah. So now, now the Rebbe applies that same thing to the Purim, that the Friday reading is sort of a preparation for the exemption of the biblical, of the Purim obligation, the real obligation on Shabbos, because there's no other way to do it. Just like there's no way to shake a lulav if you don't have one from before. There's no way to read the Megillah on Purim on Shabbos when it needs to be exempted from Friday unless you read it on Friday. And even though he's a kid, it's a bona fide obligation. Says the Rebbe, stretch it just a little more to our case. Pesach Rishon, the first Pesach and the second are one continuum. You might say, it's like in the case of the Purim, the Friday reading of the Megillah is one continuum to the Shabbos. And it exempts it. So even though in Friday he's a kid, Shabbos adult, doesn't matter, it works. Similarly here, this Rebbe is stretching it a little more. Pesach Rishon, Pesach Sheni, they're a month apart. They're one continuum. You're right, at Pesach Rishon, it doesn't have an obligation. But he has the concept of the Pesach obligation this year on Pesach Sheni. And Pesach obligation is linked to Pesach obligation a month earlier. They're linked. So by extension, he has it almost retroactively. You can't say he has a real obligation because he's a kid. But if he did it, it counts. It counts for education. But we just said that not really, not just. Because education and training here is more than that. It's actually a preparation. It's a form of doing the mitzvah. And therefore, when Pesach Rishon came as a kid, he did it. And you're going to say he has no Pesach obligation this year. Yes, he does. He'll have it in a month. So in the general conversation, bird's eye view, he does have a Pesach obligation this year. It's going to kick in a legal, bona fide biblical fashion in a month from now. But since this holiday and that holiday are really linked, and if he did it retroactively, presto, a month later, he still has it. Like the thinking of the rugged Chaver Gaon. He did it in a state of non-obligation. It still exists. How does it still exist? Because it was a mitzvah then. Because the concept of Pesach exists for this kid this year. And therefore, retroactively, it applies. I hope this is clear. So to sum it up, I'm just going to repeat this end part. I hope it's clear. To sum it up, the Rebbe is putting together the pieces. Sicha is teaching us. On the one hand, the second Pesach is a separate holiday and a separate bona fide obligation, and the child has that obligation. On the other hand, if they did it in the first one, it exempts the second. And this is going to be true even according to the Alter Rebbe, who holds that the first one is not really a real bona fide mitzvah. If it was done for him, it's just education. Still, if he did it, it exempts the second. What's the logic? And the Rebbe says, well, the Rogat Shavah teaches us that if I do a mitzvah in a non-obligatory state, and it still exists in the second instance when I become obligated, it's already done, like the non-Jew who did circumcision or like the child who had kids. And therefore, when it comes second Pesach, he still has the existence of the first. But then the Rebbe pushes back and says, in what way does that mitzvah exist? This is a double question. In what way does the second Pesach, the first Pesach exist when you get to the Pesach, even by an adult, says the Rebbe. Let's understand that. And then the second problem is with a child where the first Pesach is nothing. So first of all, how does it exist when it comes to the second Pesach? By an adult. Because even though it's a month apart and for 3 weeks you've been eating bread, Pesach seems to be over. Not really. It's two mitzvahs that are really one collective. We gave two examples to understand that. The days of the Omer, which are separate mitzvahs, but they're cumulative. The other one was if I bring the holiday peace offering on one of the days of the holiday, I don't have to continue bringing it. It's one collective. So therefore, just to understand why even an adult, if he brought the first Pesach, he's exempt and he doesn't bring the second Pesach, even though it's a separate holiday. It's a separate mitzvah, but it's a separate mitzvah as part of the same umbrella concept of Pesach. And therefore, clearly we maintain that the first Pesach exists in the second. It doesn't exist in a physical sense, like the Rugged Shavar's examples of a bris or Torah knowledge, but it exists in a mitzvah sense. So now we just have to find the way to apply that to a child for whom the first Pesach was just spring training. Says the Rebbe, I've proved already in other Sichas that training, even though my child is totally training, it's totally non-biblical. If you think about it, there's a concept of a biblical bona fide mitzvah on a child pre-bar mitzvah. How so? That he or she is obligated, biblically, to prepare for that day and be ready that the minute the day comes, they can do all the mitzvahs, like an adult. So clearly they have an obligation before, and it's real. That's the first step of this logic. The second step, therefore, we can build on that and say the Rebbe's whole theory that if I read the Megillah on the day before Shabbos, to exempt the Megillah of Shabbos in that particular calendar instance, it should count, even though I read it as a state of minority. But I need that reading as a preparation for the Shabbos reading. It's almost like I have to physically get a Megillah so that I can read it on the day of Purim. I have to physically read the Megillah on Friday so I can be exempt when Shabbos comes. The Rebbe is stretching these concepts. So then the Rebbe here stretches it one more. And even though the kid had no obligation, in the case of Purim, the kid has that obligation on Friday. But here the Rebbe stretches it more. Even though the kid had no obligation on the first Pesach, but if it was done for him or her, it exists. The obligation wasn't done because he didn't have any obligation, but it exists. So when he hits Pesach Sheni and the obligation kicks in, he's already done. Much like the adult who doesn't have to bring a second Pesach, or much like the child who arrives to adulthood and already had 2 kids. They did the mitzvah. The mitzvah exists. You can't say a child therefore has no mitzvah Pesach Rishon. The mitzvah exists. If they have Pesach Sheni, they have Pesach Rishon too. It exists even though it doesn't yet exist as a full obligation. I want to go back here for one more second. Okay, so let's review this chart. We had an A and B problem that the Rebbe said. A, how does the mitzvah effect still exist? And the Rebbe's answer, A. Both days are called Pesach. It's one continuum. The proof is that the second Pesach is a separate festival. Still, the first Pesach exempts it. So that's how we linked the two. So then we bring this, we try to apply this to a minor. B, a minor never had first Pesach obligation. The answer is, in the Rebbe's explanation, B, minor has biblical obligation to become trained as preparation for bar mitzvah obligation, much as any mitzvah preparation is biblical obligation. So now the zinger is the Rebbe's conclusion that the minor's first Pesach inclusion is a form of preparation to exempt the second Pesach obligation. This is a puzzle. He's putting together all these pieces together with the Rugged Shavar's headline. And therefore, says the Rebbe, an example of it is number 1. And therefore, says the Rebbe, that's how we'll explain it. That the minor's first Pesach exempts him for the second Pesach. And the Rebbe gives 2 examples. One of them is, number 1, the minor turning bar mitzvah on Shabbos on the 15th of Adar reads the Megillah Friday to exempt the Shabbos obligation. And in a footnote, the Rebbe gives another example. A minor turning bar mitzvah during the Omer can complete the counting. What if a kid has bar mitzvah in the middle of the Omer? I don't know, Lag BaOmer. Can he count the Omer after he becomes bar mitzvah? And remember, in order to count the Omer, you can't miss a day, even though it's 49 mitzvahs, but they all need each other. So if I miss the day, I'm done. I cannot count it, with a bracha at least. What does a kid do when he becomes bar mitzvah in the middle of the Omer? He can't count the Omer? Halacha rules that if the child counted all the days till now, he or she can continue. If he missed days, he can't continue. But you could argue, what do you mean? All the days leading up to the bar mitzvah when he was still in the age of minority, those counting the Omer don't exist. Now the mitzvah becomes on Lag BaOmer and he counts 33, 34. He's counting in a vacuum. He didn't have the first 32 days. He had it as kid, spring training. It don't count for the tally. Says the Rebbe, yes and no. This is a brilliant example. Yes and no. It's true that the first 32 days are not biblical mitzvahs, but they count. Their effect still exists when you come to day 33. Because being that the child will be in adulthood in the second half of the days of the Omer mitzvahs, and the Omer is one big collective. You can't have day 33 if you don't have the first 32. If you didn't miss those first 32 days, they count. And they're real mitzvahs in that sense. Retroactive, they become mitzvahs. Even though at the time of doing them, they were just training. But they are part of that continuum. And when you come to day 33 and you become bar mitzvah, they exist. Their mitzvah effect exists. It's very, very creative and brilliant. I want to suggest two takeaways from this Sicha. It doesn't say anything explicit in the Sicha as a takeaway, but some of this I'm borrowing from other Sichas, and perhaps some I'm stretching. I'm going to share two lessons. This is a very, very exciting Sicha on a Paltiel level. I hope I did justice to it. And again, this is as complicated as this is. I missed a lot of the detours, but I think I gave us the whole maze. Lesson number one, I want to share from another Sicha. Just from the very fact that we rule that the second Pesach is a bona fide separate holiday. Right? There's opinions that say no. But we go like Rabbi, that Pesach Sheni is a separate holiday. It's not just a makeup for the first, even though it was given as a makeup, but it becomes a bona fide date to the point that it really counts. And even though if you were a kid, but at first you bring the second. So the Rebbe always uses the concept of Pesach Sheni for the concept of tshuva. It's never too late to make up. I've said this to many people in my community who later in life start to embrace a mitzvah. They start keeping Shabbos, they start putting on tefillin, they start keeping kosher, they start using the mikveh. At the age of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, it doesn't make a difference. And they're loving it. That's the example of Shomer Shabbos. The person is 60 years old and they start keeping Shabbos. And they realize how special Shabbos is, how pivotal. It's fundamental. It changes your life. It means that you're connected with Hashem. It's huge. And then they'll often come to me after keeping Shabbos for a year or 2 or 5 and say, this is so great. This is what a Jew is. But we missed 55 years of this. And you could say, well, it wasn't your fault. You didn't know. It's all true. But they missed it. No, the argument would be they didn't miss it. In Judaism, tshuva, just like Pesach Sheni, makeup date is a bona fide date. When your life journey brings you to the point that you're ready to make that change, and now your journey has brought you to the place where you're ready to embrace Shabbos, and you truly embrace it with a real commitment, it's like you never missed the Shabbos. Because Pesach Sheni, translation, Teshuvah, the opportunity to make up, is a bona fide date. It's not just a make-up date to what you missed. God, in his plan for you, set you up Teshuvah, set you up that you're going to go through a journey and you will make it up. And when you make it up, that's your first Shabbos. So retroactive, we did all the Shabboses. This point, by the way, is spelled out, especially in the mitzvah mikvah, where it is said that when a woman uses the mikvah, even later in life, even after the time when she's going to use it on a monthly basis, she uses it once. We were taught clearly by the Rabbi that this retroactively mikvahs all of the relationships and all of the children that were born. The same would probably be true with every other mitzvah. The makeup date is a bona fide date. God says that's a bona fide journey. It's almost like just like there's 2 separate journeys. Those who are brought up raised, born and bred, and from birth, their journey is that they have to do. They should try not to mess up. Everybody does, but that's another conversation. And then there's another journey that God set up. It's another bona fide journey. They're Pesach Sheni Jews. They're going to grow up without it. And at some point, they're going to pick it up. And when they pick it up, it's a bona fide date. God says, great. You got the right date. As soon as you were ready, you did it. And you did it with a real commitment. You never missed a single Shabbos. And the second lesson, which is very much linked to the first. The Sicha is pointing out that every mitzvah preparation is part of the mitzvah. You can't have a sukkah unless you prepare for it before. Even though it's before sukkahs, it becomes an obligation. Or in this case, the kid did Pesach Rishon when he was a kid. But it applies because you need that Pesach in order for the second one to be exempted. Every mitzvah preparation is a mitzvah. Apply that to our personal journey. It's also related to teshuvah. And all of us are trying to be Baal teshuvah. Even if you're from birth. You struggle, you have your ups and downs, etc., etc. All of these steps and twists and turns in the journey of life and our spiritual/emotional journey to connect to Hashem and do the right thing and then slip up and pick ourselves up with the bootstraps and keep on going. All of these things are mitzvah preps. They're part of my journey and they all count biblically. They all matter. It's the same takeaway. Don't look back and say what I did wrong. Take the impetus from it and move forward. As I heard from a wonderful chassid and shliach, Rabbi Aaron Lezer Tzeitlin of blessed memory, that he once told the Rebbe when he had a yechidus at the age of 18, and he wrote in his notes things that he felt were mess-ups and slip-ups. I don't know what they were. I'm assuming they were, he was a good yeshiva bacher, chassidish bacher. I'm assuming they were probably finer points. But the reality is that he wrote to the Rebbe in his note that he messed up a whole bunch of stuff. And he expected the Rebbe to tell him how to rectify it. And the Rebbe told him, I heard this from him, that the shlichus from my neshama, the mission, the purpose of my soul on earth, is for the heva and the asid, for the present and for the future, nishvar and over, not for the past. That's the words of the Rebbe. What's the Rebbe saying? As the leader of our generation, that the approach of our generation, the generation, the last generation of exile, the first generation of Geula. What's the approach of our generation? What's the way to recognize redemption and Hashem in our reality? Is to recognize it's not about the past. And you know why? Because in truth, being that Hashem is the ultimate truth and every single thing that happens, including the bad, the good, bad, and the ugly, and the mistakes that we made, and even the sins that we committed, they're all part of our journey because Hashem is all invasive and pervasive. That's what Mashiach means. There's nothing beside Hashem. And you know what? In your mistakes, he's there. And in your journeys, he's there. And on your sins, he's there, the Rebbe said. And therefore, not that you should do it, but once it's done, know that it's part of your journey. And therefore, the shlichus of the Rebbe and therefore of our generation is not about the past. It's about the present and the future. Because it's all part of it. It's almost like the past mistakes that we've made and the confusions that we've endured are become a preparation for the current mitzvah because they propelled us and brought us to this space. And therefore, it is all elevated.